Welcome back to the Space LV Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. It's good to be with you. It's been a long time.
It's been a while. We've done solo podcasts. You did one, I did one, and now we're back together. So it's good to be together.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, it's especially good to be together because we have a good guest to talk to today. Our guest is Filip Mazurczak, who is a writer, a translator. He's a doctoral candidate at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And Bobby, you and I have both really enjoyed Filip's writings in First Things, The European Conservative, Catholic World Report, and other places. So we're really happy to have him today. Filip, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, we're really delighted to be talking, and we thought we would start off with talking about a man whose work you translated, who is a really important figure in Poland, but is somebody who I think used to be probably a little better known in a lot of other places, and maybe his legacy is fading in some areas a little bit. And this is Cardinal Wyszyński, who was a famous Polish churchman, and was kind of the head of the church in Poland for years and years and years and years, especially during kind of the meat of the communist era in Poland. So, for those of our listeners who have never heard of Cardinal Wyszyński before, would you just tell us a little bit about him before we dig a little deeper?
Well, he was born in 1901 and died in 1981, and he was the primate of Poland from 1948 until his death in 1981, so for 33 years. Today, the office of primate of Poland is just a purely symbolic office that has zero power. Today, basically, the Archbishop of Gniezno, which is not a terribly large archdiocese, it's historically a very important archdiocese because Gniezno is the cradle of Polish statehood. It's where the first Polish capital was, but it's not a large archdiocese. However, in Wyszyński's time, the primate of Poland was both the Archbishop of Gniezno and the Archbishop of Warsaw at the same time. Wyszyński was also the head of the Polish Bishops' Conference for many years. So he really did have a major leadership role. If you read George Weigel's book, The Final Revolution, which was published in the early 90s, and it's about the role of the Catholic Church in the collapse of communism, it specifically deals with two countries, Poland and Czechoslovakia. Other countries are just briefly mentioned. Weigel quotes Joseph Stalin as saying that bringing communism to Poland is like saddling a cow. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that communism was, in the Polish mind, associated with Russia. Interestingly enough, Karl Marx himself did not think very highly of Russia and the Russians. Karl Marx would have been shocked that the communist revolution first took place in Russia. He expected it to take place in England, where he lived, but it naturally did not. Also, Lenin lived for some time, for about 14 months or so, here in Krakow. This was when Poland was partitioned, and he thought that he'd find an ally in the Poles because he wanted to abolish the Tsar, and the Poles also wanted to get rid of the Tsar. But this was kind of unrequited love. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that Marx, even though he didn't like Russia, he actually did think highly of Poland, of the Poles. He once wrote that the May 3rd Constitution, which is the second constitution in the world after the American and before the French Constitution, that he wrote that it was the most noble action of the nobility. In 1920, Lenin tried to invade Poland, and Poland wasn't his final destination. He planned on creating revolution throughout Europe. Later, he wanted to go to Germany, France, Italy, although the Soviets lost the Polish Bolshevik War. So this also did not endear the Poles to communism. And the second reason is the Catholic faith of the majority. of the Polish people. And so Wyszyński not only helped the Polish church survive, but he in fact strengthened the Polish church. During the 1930s, he he worked as a priest in the city of Włocławek, which is actually where my grandmother is from. And Włocławek is in northwestern Poland. It's an industrial, now post-industrial city, but at that time it had a major cellulose factory, and Wyszyński was seen as a sort of progressive priest because he gave the workers at the cellulose factory lectures on Catholic social teaching and on their rights. He also fought for their rights. For example, thanks to his efforts, workers in Włocławek at the cellulose factory were given soap. At that time, he also edited a journal called Ateneum Kapłańskie, in which he wrote a lot about Catholic social teaching. During the Second World War, about half of all the priests in the Włocławek diocese were murdered. So one book I recommend is Empire of Destruction by the British historian Alexander J.K. And he writes about the different groups of people who were killed by Nazi Germany. And of course, we have to remember the tragedy of the Holocaust, the tragedy of the Jewish people, which was a unique tragedy. Every single Jewish man, woman, and child was intended to be murdered. But there were also other groups, and those included the Polish intelligentsia. In the first months of the war, the Germans killed about 100,000 Polish priests, university professors, school teachers, lawyers, politicians, etc., in order to make it more difficult for the Polish people to resist. And so Wyszyński was on the run from the Gestapo during the war. He worked as a chaplain of the Laski community. The Laski community was founded by Mother Róża Czacka, who was beatified 3 years ago, along with Wyszyński. And she started a community for blind children just outside of Warsaw, and Wyszyński was their chaplain. Later, they moved to the Lublin province to avoid the SS. And so he was a chaplain to the Laski community and to the Polish resistance during the war. He also helped shelter a Jewish family during the war. And in 1948, at the age of just 47, Wyszyński was named the Bishop of Lublin in eastern Poland. 2 years later, he became primate. And Wyszyński was a practical man at first. So initially, he signed a sort of agreement with the communist regime, in which the communist regime agreed that it would stay out of the church's affairs, but and in the meantime, the church wouldn't be that much of a thorn in the side of the regime. Although these were, of course, empty promises. In 1953, the year that Joseph Stalin died, the anti-Catholic campaign in the Polish People's Republic reached its apex. The Curia here in Kraków, so several priests and lay people who worked for the Curia were accused of being spies for the CIA. They were convicted of being spies for the CIA and of handling currency, which, of course, these were BS charges, as was the case under communism, under Stalinism especially. And they were sentenced to either life in prison or to death. Later, those death sentences were commuted. During this time, the religious education was withdrawn from schools. Many hundreds of priests were imprisoned and murdered. In 1953, also the lay Catholic weekly Tygodnik Powszechny was shut down when it refused to publish an obituary praising Stalin. And so Cardinal Wyszyński began to protest against the government's interference in church affairs. And he wrote a letter in which he protested against this, and he said, now I'm paraphrasing, that when Caesar tries to sit on God's throne, we can't allow this, non possumus, which was a famous line in this letter, non possumus, so we cannot in Latin. And so Wyszyński was arrested and spent 3 years imprisoned in former monasteries, but of course, the location of his incarceration was not disclosed because he was a popular figure in Poland, and the regime did not disclose where he was imprisoned. At that time, he had 2 fellow inmates, his secretary and a nun who later turned out to snitch on him to the regime. And during these 3 lonely years, Wyszyński decided to make them fruitful. So naturally, bearing in mind the difference of circumstances, I am kind of reminded of Cardinal Pell's prison writings, which were published by Ignatius Press. And Cardinal Pell kind of treated his time in prison when he was falsely accused as a sort of spiritual retreat, and to read books he hadn't had the opportunity to read, like War and Peace. Well, Wyszyński also tried to make this time fruitful, and during this time he came up with a program for renewal called the Great Novena. In 966, Poland was baptized. The first ruler of Poland, Mieszko I, was baptized. So that anniversary, 1000th anniversary, was approaching. And Wyszyński decided to draft a very ambitious program of renewal to remind the Poles of the source of their nationhood. So in 1956, there was a thaw in the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev gave his famous speech denouncing the personality cult of Stalinism. In the USSR, most of the gulags were closed. Censorship was eased. Books like The Master and Margarita or One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich were published in censored form, but published nonetheless. So likewise in Poland, there was also a thaw, and the new leader of Poland was a fellow named Władysław Gomułka, who was part of the communist resistance during World War II, and was actually imprisoned under Stalinism and was seen as a sort of right-wing nationalist communist, although he's not exactly like Imre Nagy in Hungary. He was still a die-in-the-wool Marxist. So Wyszyński was released, but that didn't stop him from protesting against the communist government's abuses. And the millennium of Christianity in Poland in 1966 was a major event. Pope Paul VI was the first pope to travel outside of Italy, was invited to attend. And actually, as a young man, as a young priest, Father Giovanni Battista Montini, the future Paul VI, actually worked for a brief time in the papal nunciature in Warsaw, so he even spoke some basic Polish. Paul VI agreed to come to Poland, but the communist regime would not let him in. So Wyszyński championed the vision of the Christian vision of the Polish nation, the Christian roots of the Polish nation, and he was, I think that indirectly, without him, I don't know if solidarity would have been possible. I don't know if if not for Wyszyński, I don't know if the Poles would have gone the way of, say, the Czechs or the Hungarians or the East Germans, although East Germany is mostly Protestant, and simply become atheistic and irreligious. So Wyszyński bolstered the Polish people's identity, Catholic identity, under communism, and this would have disastrous consequences in the long term for the regime.
No, that's excellent, Philip. Before coming to Poland and marrying my wife, who I think everybody by now knows is Polish, I didn't know much about Wyszyński. I don't think even though I read The Witness to Hope, but when I finally came to Poland, I saw Wyszyński like everywhere. I mean, maybe not as much of a national hero as John Paul II in terms of his, image being all over the place. It is though, nevertheless, all over the place. And so, naturally speaking, I was trying to find like his writings, and I found like a biography here and there, and some of his other writings in English. But it wasn't until I did not know that he wrote so much, and so I just want to bring up your recent translation of Love and Social Justice: Reflections on Society, Blessed Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński, which I've been going through this, and this is a great work. And like you said, his interest in Catholic social teaching is just evident throughout all of these pages. And this is such a great antidote, though, not antidote, actually, in a way, presenting the church's social teaching in the 20th century in light of all of these issues regarding the various ideologies that are out there today. So could you say maybe a little bit about this translation that you've made in this work in particular? And I mean, basically, why is this important for even American Catholics? I think mainly most of our viewers are from America, but people outside of Poland to read these works.
I was. This was not my initiative to translate this. In early 2020, right before the pandemic exploded, I got an email from Alex Barbas, who's the editor-in-chief and founder of Aroka Press, which is a great independent Catholic publisher. One-man operation, even though Alex has a full-time job elsewhere. I don't know how he finds the time to run such a wonderful publisher, but he somehow does. He approached me. He'd gotten contact information from another translator to me and asked if I'd be interested in translating this work. And I said, sure. We applied for a grant. There's this government institution in Poland called the Book Institute, which gives grants for translators each year. I've actually participated in, I think, 3 grants from them. We ultimately got the money, got the grant, and so I went through with it. Why is this important? Well, so this book, we don't know when exactly this book was written. It was probably written around 1942. It was almost certainly written during World War II, and we know this because Wyszyński makes multiple references to Nazi Germany. He condemns Nazi Germany's paganism and racism as being inconsistent and contrary to Christianity. He also mentions the bombing of Polish churches by the Luftwaffe in 1939, but at the same time, he does not make any references to the communist regime in the post-war period. So that's why he probably, we think, wrote this book during the war when he was in hiding from the Gestapo. So that's 82 years. A lot has changed since then. But at the same time, I think that his writings are relevant. In the book, Wyszyński deals with all of the socio-political ideologies that the church was confronted with in the 20th century, such as not only fascism, Nazism, and communism, but also capitalism. And so, I mean, I'm a millennial. I was born in the late 80s, and many people, many Americans, many Westerners of my generation are drawn to Marxism, but at the same, which of course is bad, but at the same time, to an extent, I understand where they're coming from. And for example, in his encyclical Laborem Exercens, John Paul II explains why Marxism appeared. right? So, no, my generation did not experience Dickensian capitalism, but I remember being a college student, and that was a really scary time because that was during the Great Recession, and unemployment had been at its highest level since the 1930s, and so a lot of American millennials have lost their faith in laissez-faire capitalism. And I think Wyszyński explains why laissez-faire capitalism is inconsistent with Christianity, with Catholic social teaching, although, of course, socialism is communism is as well. If you read what Ayn Rand wrote, for example, is what she wrote consistent with Christianity? No, I don't think so. So this sort of libertarian free market fetishism is also rejected by Wyszyński with regards to his rejection of fascism and racism. Well, I mean, in the United States, obviously, racism is still a major issue. And also with, for example, Russia's aggression, we can see that nationalism understood in a negative way can be not only harmful, but in fact deadly. And yet Wyszyński is a patriot. His Polish patriotism is clear through this. And I think that sometimes vices can be perversions of virtues. And so, for example, extreme nationalism is a perversion of patriotism, which I think is a good thing, which is a virtue. So I think Wyszyński offers a good balance that's grounded in Catholic social teaching. He experienced it all firsthand. He experienced communism. He experienced Nazism. He saw workers being shabbily treated by capitalists in Włocławek. So yeah, I think he definitely was the right man to write about this.
It does seem, Philip, that there's a real opportunity now for precisely the reasons you were explaining. Young people who lived through the kind of financial crisis of the late 2000s. I'm a little older than you, so I was sort of in a slightly different place, but it was a real shock. And I think especially because it had to do with home ownership and sort of this like basic thing that is like touted as kind of one of the major, one of the main things about kind of living in a capitalist society and that sort of thing. But what I'm coming to is, someone like Wyszyński, I think also of Solzhenitsyn or Pope Benedict for that matter, or other figures like that who clearly articulate something other than just kind of the old Cold War binary, right? And clearly now here we are into our second decade, third decade, or whatever, into the 21st century. People are looking for something else, and I'm hopeful that maybe the church can do a bit of that, articulate a bit of that, and that brings me to maybe shift the discussion a little bit to the state of the church today, I guess, for lack of a better way of thinking about it. You wrote a great article back in January that I think probably hasn't gotten quite enough attention. So I want to give it a little bit of attention today. You wrote for Catholic World Report an article called "The State of the Catholic Faith in Post-COVID Poland." Now, I think it hasn't gotten enough attention because I actually think that people are a little bit afraid to uncover what COVID has really done to us. I think it is really a monumental thing that has happened, that has created changes in societies that we're still just like barely able to cope with. And one of the things it's done is clearly it has affected the church. Now, Poland is an interesting place that Bobby and I talk about a lot on our podcast, and we think about a lot. There are people out there who say, well, Poland is destined to just go the way of Ireland with regard to the Catholic faith. Now, the statistics do not bear that out yet at all. Poland is still an outlier in many ways as a place where people go to church and take their faith seriously. However, clearly the pandemic had a major effect on church attendance in Poland, just as it did in the United States. So I don't know. There are various questions I'd love to kind of get into about kind of the state of the church in Poland with regard to society. But just on the surface, like what did COVID do to the church in Poland? Let's start there.
Well, I mean, it didn't do this just to the church in Poland. In the article you mentioned, I also cite statistics from the United States, from Italy, from I think several other countries. A certain percentage of people who attended Mass stopped attending Mass. So before the pandemic, church attendance in Poland was about 37%. Now it's about 30%. So a decline of 7%, which in the course of only a few years is a pretty significant decline. In the United States, likewise, if you go to the Georgetown University has the Center for Applied Research on the Apostolate, which offers a lot of really good statistics on the church in the U.S. and the world. And they're also in the U.S. before the pandemic, it was like 24%. Now it's more like 19%. So so I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist, but I think that what had happened was that simply a certain percentage of people got out of the habit of going to Mass. With regards to Poland, you mentioned comparisons to Ireland. Well, every country is different, and so there are certain similarities between the church in Poland and Ireland, and also certain differences. One similarity is that both the Poles and the Irish spent a large part of their history under foreign oppression, and these foreign oppressors were not Catholic and oftentimes oppressed the church. Of course, American people know Ireland well because almost every white American had a great-great-great-great-grandfather named Seamus O'Finnegan who came from a village in County Cork, and they drink green beer on St. Patrick's Day, which of course makes them Irish. So they know that the Irish were oppressed by the Protestant British. In Poland, there are certain similarities. In the late 18th century, Poland was partitioned by Russia, Prussia, which later would become Germany after the unification of Germany, and Austria. And of course, the Habsburgs were uber Catholic, but in the German and Russian partitions of Poland, the church was harassed, and the church was the reservoir of Polish identity, just like it was the oasis of Irish identity under British rule. There are some differences that are important, if you don't mind that I'm giving such a long-winded answer. One difference is that in Ireland, it was solely the church that was really the marker of Irish identity, because the Irish had become anglicized. But in Poland, it was also culture and literature. The Polish language survived despite campaigns to ban it by especially the Germans and the Russians, because the Austrians were very liberal and tolerant oppressors, if you will. Also, today, I mean, not in 1938, but in the 19th century. So today, Ireland is one of the richest countries in Europe. In terms of gross domestic product per capita, it ranks up there with Luxembourg, Norway, and Switzerland. I've never been there, but I know it's a very wealthy country. Well, when Ireland gained its independence in 1922, it was dirt poor. It was a very poor country. And I mean, the fact that so many Americans and also Australians, Canadians, British, etc., have Irish ancestry, this attests to the fact that Ireland was once very poor, which is why so many people left it. And when Ireland gained its independence, the state was too poor to finance very basic services like education or healthcare or social services like orphanages. The church, and so it was the church that took over all of this. From what I understand, even though Ireland's become quite secularized, I think that still the vast majority of schools are run by the church in Ireland. And so because the church had all these institutions, this was where a lot of abuses took place, not only sexual, but also physical and emotional abuses like the Magdalene laundries, etc. By contrast, in Poland, in 1945, the communists confiscated almost everything that the church ran. Almost all church schools, seminaries, could operate freely. The Catholic University of Lublin was pretty much left unmolested. But like the church's schools and charitable institutions, they were all seized by the state. So I think that because of this, the scale of these abuses in Ireland was greater. Recently, apart from the pandemic, Poland has also gone through the issue of clerical sexual abuse. Although it happened later than in the United States. For example, in the United States, Pandora's box was opened in 2002 with the Boston Globe articles on Cardinal law and predator priests like John Gagin. In Poland, an analogous phenomenon occurred in 2018, 2019, so much later. So lately, in recent years, there's been a lot of, anti-clericalism in Poland in the liberal media. Of course, sexual abuse is disgusting and something that should never be excused. At the same time, the liberal media in Poland has used this as a sort of stick to beat up the whole church. And sometimes different accusations have been dishonest. For example, a couple years ago, two liberal Polish media accused the bishop of Świdnica in Lower Silesia of molesting someone 30 years ago. This was based on very shaky foundations, and so the bishop himself handed over the case to the prosecutor's office, and a judge found him innocent, cleared him of these accusations, and so the bishop sued these newspapers for libel, and won. So this has not been an easy time. At the same time, I think the situation's a little bit complicated. In the past year or two, I have seen several positive trends in Poland. One is that this is just this year. So we'll see what future years will bring. But this year in Poland, there's actually an increase in vocations to the priesthood, an increase in young men being accepted into seminaries compared to last year. Of course, the numbers still are much smaller than they were in the 1980s, for example. Another factor to bear in mind is that there were simply more young people in the 1980s, and during the 1980s, under communism, becoming a priest was also a political statement, and I think maybe a lot of men entered seminaries for the wrong reasons. But we do have this increase this year, which we should be grateful to God for. Also this year, there was a big increase in the number of Poles participating in walking pilgrimages to Częstochowa, the most important Marian shrine in Poland. It's still not at the level of pre-pandemic, but it's still a huge increase over the previous year. There's a new government in Poland for about that's been in power for about a year, and it's trying to pursue a liberal course. There have been very large pro-life demonstrations against the new governments. Also, I read that this year polls where I think the biggest group of foreign pilgrims to Fatima and a record group of record number of Poles attended the shrine in Fatima. And yet, at the same time, we still do have this decrease in recent years. So the picture, I'd say, is complicated. And I'd say that in Poland and probably in many other parts of the West, we have on the one hand the sort of polarization between society. The number of people who are indifferent to religion, I think, is shrinking. People are either becoming increasingly hostile to the faith or are growing deeper in their faith. So moving from Poland to France. So in 1980, Pope John Paul II visited France and famously said, "France, eldest daughter of the church, what have you done with your faith?" But yet, in the past couple of years, in France, there's been a big increase in adults seeking baptism. The number of seminarians in France, while low, is still stable. There's been a big increase in the number of French pilgrims who go on the pilgrimage to Chartres. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly because I don't speak French. And yet, so on the one hand, if you look at these statistics, you might think that France is in great shape, but yet mass attendance in France is like 2%. So I think that in Poland, France, and the United States, and many Western countries, we have this sort of phenomenon in which maybe the church is smaller, but the people who are in the church are growing maybe deeper in their faith. At the same time, if this is an accurate assessment, I really think that Christianity should not be elitist, right? Our aim is for everyone to be saved. So we shouldn't be happy that our numbers are smaller, but at least we're vibrant. Instead, we should try to preach the good word through words and above all deeds to everyone. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, Philip, you mentioned, I think in this article, the various attempts of some of the media to tarnish the image of John Paul II as kind of like one of the short-term goals to this long-term goal, eventually, of undermining the authority of the church. And you so well kind of document how this kind of has backfired. But could you say maybe a little bit about one of those documentaries that TVN came out with a couple of years ago? I believe it's called Franciszek,
which is the street address of the Metropolitan Curia in Krakow. Okay, so the left hates the church. I haven't said anything original or unique. And that's the case in Poland, it's the case in France, it's the case in the United States, it's the case everywhere. It's the case in Nicaragua, certainly, and Venezuela. So, for example, let's compare Poland to Spain. So, I know that a lot of conservative Catholics have a warm spot in their hearts for General Franco because they say he saved Spain from communism. Yeah, he probably did save Spain from communism, but he was also a repressive dictator. And he was also, even though Spain was officially neutral during World War II, he was pretty much allied with Hitler and Mussolini. And so for 36 years, Spain was ruled by an oppressive right-wing dictatorship that was also uber-Catholic. General Franco was a very devout Catholic. And so when Franco died in 1975, that's also the year Saturday Night Live started, and Chevy Chase would famously say on Weekend Update, Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead, or whatever, for weeks afterwards. So when Franco died, the Spanish people left the church en masse, and the left didn't need to distort history, because the fact that there was a brutal, repressive, but very Catholic dictatorship in very recent memory, I mean, that was enough for people to leave the church. But in Poland, since we have this, which this have what I mentioned, that for 200 years of foreign oppression, and that does include the communist dictatorship, because really it was controlled by Moscow. The church played a very positive role through priests like Cardinal Wyszyński, or Blessed Jerzy Popiełuszko was the chaplain to Solidarity, who was murdered by the regime, or priests like St. Maximilian Kolbe, and above all, St. John Paul II. Well, someone might, even someone who's not religious might say, well, I don't go to church, I don't know if God exists, but we can't just throw out the baby with the bathwater, because the church did play an important role and positive role in our history. And so in order to weaken Catholicism, the liberal media tried to defame John Paul II. And in last year, a documentary, and maybe, I know I'm breaking, what's it called, Godwin's rule, but I can't help but think of Leni Riefenstahl, or Godwin's principle, whatever it's called, that you lose an argument whenever you compare someone to Hitler. But it broadcasted a very tendentious documentary, and also a publishing house affiliated with Gazeta Wyborcza, which is a newspaper that was started in 1989 by Solidarity activists, actually, but by leftist secular Solidarity activists, which was definitely the minority of Solidarity. These were people who are basically reformist Marxists. And Gazeta Wyborcza really does not like the Catholic Church, never has. So their publishing house published a book attacking John Paul II the same week that TVN published this pseudo-documentary. And interestingly enough, the author of this book is a correspondent for the Dutch media, but he speaks Polish well. So I call him the Lying Dutchman. I'm kind of proud of that witticism. So anyway, so this book by the Lying Dutchman and the TVN documentary claim that when John Paul II, the future John Paul II, was the Archbishop of Krakow, he covered up sexual abuse, and they mentioned 3 cases of priests who allegedly were shuffled to different parishes, cardinal law style, by John Paul II. Well, historians very quickly responded to this and said that these allegations were unsubstantiated. What I can say is that these events happened more than 50 years ago, and so today an archbishop would deal somewhat differently with such cases. But John Paul II dealt better in my opinion, with these cases than the vast majority of bishops in probably both Poland and around the world. So, for example, one priest was accused of molesting multiple children at a parish in some village in the Archdiocese of Krakow. And so this priest, the parents of the children who were abused approached Cardinal Wojtyła, and Cardinal Wojtyła immediately suspended this abusive priest. Actually, he suspended him before the communist police arrested him. And so when this abusive priest was released from prison, and he spent like 1.5 years in prison, which I also think shows a lot, because today for molesting children, I'm sure you'd have a much harsher sentence. So I think that shows that all of society, and even communists who would take any opportunity possible to discredit the church, didn't realize how traumatic this was. And so when this priest was released, he asked if he could be reassigned to parish work. So Cardinal Wojtyła told him that he will take up the issue with the Metropolitan Tribunal. the tribunal ultimately decided that apparently, according to canon law at that time, a priest who had been punished by civil authorities for sexual offense could be excused from church penalties. But Cardinal Wojtyła still decided that this would not be a good idea to reassign this priest to parish work. So he had him go to a monastery and copy old manuscripts by hand. So he isolated him from work with young people. After a few years, however, this priest hadn't committed any sexual offenses, and Cardinal Wojtyła allowed him to be a hospital chaplain, seeing that he hadn't hurt anyone for several years. So today we know that sex offenders are that it's extremely difficult to cure sex offenders. But back then, therapists, psychologists believe that you can, that if you send a sex abuser to therapy, he or she will be cured. And so if after multiple years this priest hadn't committed any offenses, John Paul II gave him another chance. From today's perspective, that is a mistake, but that did not result from John Paul II's ill will. I think rather from the state of psychiatry and psychology at the time. But TVN and the Lying Dutchman used this as an opportunity to claim that John Paul II shuffled an abusive priest to another, that he made him a hospital chaplain. Another priest was, so as you probably know, the borders of Poland shifted westwards after the war. And so, for example, the Archdiocese of Lwów, which today is in Ukraine, then was annexed by the Soviet Union. So there was a priest who was from this archdiocese, and so just a tiny fragment of this Archdiocese of Lwów found itself in the new Polish borders, and it became the Diocese of Lubaczów, which no longer exists. And so this priest was from the Diocese of Lubaczów, and he worked in the Archdiocese of Kraków. And he was also accused of molesting minors. And as soon as John Paul II found out about this, he immediately kicked him out of his archdiocese. So where's the controversy? Well, then a few years later, he ended up working in a different diocese. And so once again, the liberal media in Poland used this as evidence against John Paul II. What they did not say was that John Paul II had zero authority about those priests being admitted to work in another diocese. It was his bishop of Lubaczów who allowed him to work in another diocese. Cardinal Wojtyła, the most he could do was kick him out of the diocese, and that's exactly what he did. So there really there was no negligence on John Paul II's part, and I think historians and honest journalists demonstrated this quite well. There was a huge backlash. I mean, in Warsaw, there was a march in defense of John Paul II, which 50,000 people attended. In Kraków, there was also a big march, which I attended. I remember it was really cold and rainy that day, so not exactly a day when you want to go outside, but yet it was pretty well attended. And all the public opinion polls done at this time show that most Poles rejected these accusations. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, and Philip, just to follow up maybe with a comment here, I think a lot of our listeners and viewers will be surprised when they think of this controversy that you just sort of described, in the context of really it still being a Catholic country, which is something that we don't have a Catholic country in America, right? So our mass levels are decreasing pretty comparably to what they are in Poland. But you point out in this article that in 2022, so as we're coming out of the pandemic, of the 302,165 babies born, 99% of them were baptized. So, I mean, we're still talking about basically a baptized country, a Catholic country, right? Which is, to me, a real sign of hope. Despite the attacks against the church that are going on.
Oh yes, definitely. Although I think it's probably in Poland for many of these people who baptize their children. This is seen as a kind of as something cultural, just like in the United States, for example, many secular Jews who don't believe in God have their children attend bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs. So I think it's something comparable to that. But yes, that is true that cultural Catholicism is still strong. The number of people getting married in the church is decreasing, but I think that that is largely due to the fact that simply there's more divorces. And so if someone gets divorced and remarried, well, unless they get an annulment, they can't get married in the church. Yeah, also, the vast majority of children go to receive their first Holy Communion.
Yeah. I still think there's a lot of, work for the church in terms of, making sure that the faithful are educated in the faith. And also, I mean, it's still like the new evangelization still rings true in Poland. I'm sometimes surprised, because I teach at a school in which, half of the students are Polish, and I think most of them are baptized. But from the little that I know in terms of teaching them a little bit of history, which covers Christianity, they know very little of the basics. And so they're surrounded by this stuff all around Krakow, right? You'd think that there'd probably be a little bit more, but I think that, like you said, it's kind of a cultural thing. But nevertheless, I mean, that's there's actually, it's really easy then to point those things out. And I find many students are actually kind of a little bit intrigued, once they get beyond associating the faith with grandma, my babushka, or, is my babsha, sorry, is the one who keeps going to the church. They start, I think, taking an interest, but nevertheless, I kind of get a little bit upset though when I hear some people, like, you hear Roger saying this every now and then, that not to bring up Ireland again, but Poland is destined for something like Ireland, and it always kind of gets me a little bit upset because I'm not maybe I am a little attributing something to Roger, but it almost seems like there's almost like a joy in that destiny of that's happening to Poland.
So a couple things on that. The first thing is, like I said, there is a decrease, but there are also some optimistic signs. With regards to Rod Dreher, well, he was raised Methodist. Then he converted to Catholicism, but then he became PO'd at the Catholic Church for the sexual abuse scandal, and then became Orthodox. So someone who left the Catholic Church, I mean, you can't expect them to. I mean, yeah, you can certainly expect someone to feel Schadenfreude about declining numbers in the church. With regards to Ireland, so I've never been there. I'm not an expert on Ireland, but I do know that there are some initiatives for the new evangelization there that are doing quite well. Like there's this movement called Youth 2000 there. Also, there's this other group of lay missionaries. I can't remember the name, but on the podcast Pints with Aquinas, there's an interview with someone who runs this. So I mean, I think there could be hope for Ireland, even though I'm not an expert on the country.
Well, we certainly believe that there's hope for Poland. We happen to believe that there's hope for America, actually, by looking back to the old world for the kind of mark of faith, which is still there. It's still very much there. And I know that in a place like Poland, it's kind of more visible maybe than even in other parts of Europe. So, Philip, yeah, go ahead.
Me?
Oh yeah, sorry. I thought you were gonna
Oh no,
reply.
no, I was just anything.
Okay. Well, on that note, Filip Mazurczak, we are so grateful that you were able to make the time to join us today, and maybe next time we'll delve into some more topics. We encourage our listeners and viewers to search you out on the internet and find your work, and we hope that you'll join us again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For all of our listeners and viewers, we encourage you to share this podcast, to rate and review it, and to check out our website, spacealvyinstitute.com, where you can sign up for our emails so you don't ever miss anything new. Until next time, God bless and live in hope.